Okay, I wanted to review this book, The Closing of the American Mind. Um, Originally, a while ago, I looked for some reviews of this on YouTube, and there was maybe two of them. They weren't really that detailed. In one of them, this guy was reviewing it, and he was very dismissive of the book. He summarized it in a sentence. He said it had something about how it described the acquisition of knowledge, and he said that the author Allan Bloom needlessly did a lot of name dropping, and the guy didn't really like the book. I thought that was strange. There are also things you could read online that say that people of the right historically found this book to be a big defense of where they stand politically, I suppose, or perhaps how they vote. And I also think that was kind of a shallow, well, I think that's a shallow interpretation of what this book is. I haven't read that many books in my life. I've maybe read about 50, but this one has probably had the biggest relieving effect on my life. It's been very important to me in that way. I read a large number of C.S. Lewis books. I read all the Chronicles of Narnia. I read all three parts of the Space trilogy. I read The Problem of Pain. I read some of his other essays. He had a book, Lewis did, called The Great Divorce, and that book is probably right behind this one on the books that have had a significant effect on my life. But I think this one is the most important. I read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. This has been more important to me than that. More important than To Kill a Mockingbird. Um, so it's had a big influence, a big effect on me. Um, I'll walk through the contents of the book to review it, and I'll try to. I can't. I haven't. It's been a while since I read it, since I finished it. But I'll try to show what the book is discussing. In the introduction, Allan Bloom talks about what he calls our virtue, and for Americans, he says this is a certain kind of openness. He says that there's a big movement in this country to have relativistic morality, and a lot of people who have tried to get into philosophy know what that means. Uh, there's this idea of whether morality is absolute or relativistic, and he says that most Americans these days, or certainly a lot of students, they have this idea that morality is relative, and there's this idea that uh, people who are different from you are allowed to have their morality while you can have your own, and that's not a problem. And he opens his book that way in his introduction, talking about how open to all these points of view students apparently are. And he doesn't really describe it like it's necessarily a good thing. He says that this is the reality in which he finds himself. He wrote this book in 1989, and he died not long after that. There are three parts to the book once he gets started. Part one is students, and this is in this section of the book he tries to talk about the status quo of life in the United States, especially as seen through the students he encounters as a professor. Um, the clean slate. That's one of the things he mentions. He says about students is that when they come into the university these days, they kind of have this tabula rasa perspective on the humanities. In the United States, students are not really taught from K through 12 that much in depth about the humanities. They might read some books from history, but they don't really get very in depth into it, and they don't really see it as something that has an impact on their lives. It seems something very remote to them, and he notices that when they get to the university, this is how American students are. He contrasts this with how he says students are in Europe. He says in France, from an early age, students may have this identity associated with themselves. I don't know what I've never been to France, so I don't know how this is. But he says that French students can identify with either a Cartesian way of looking at reality or a Pascalian way of looking at reality, and this happens very early in their life. And then when they arrive at a university, they already have that past in them, and their university professors have to uh, work with that when the students arrive. American students, American students, when they get to college, they don't really have that bias or influence working on them, and so they're kind of really open to learning anything, and they're kind of very happy to do that. He says that originally it struck him as kind of strange, but then he thought it was okay. He said that students would be willing to uh, read literature or history or philosophy, and they would be kind of eager to take that knowledge in. Um, Many at that age in the United States, that's an age where you have a lot of leisure time. When you're in college, I suppose you could be there, maybe thinking you're going to relax and uh, go to a certain number of parties and make a lot of friends and have time away from your parents. And so you have this independence, but you don't really have a job where you go to school, you have classes, you have homework and finals, but you don't. It's a little different from having a job, and so you have all this um, time, and you could throw it into trying to ingest something intellectual and trying to make that a part of your life, and in a very personal way, in a way that you're going to take very seriously. And he kind of admired that about American students. Um, he thinks relationships. I'm not sure. I don't remember what that refers to. He describes students as nice, and he says that he picked that word carefully. He thought that students were a little timid about having a strong view on anything, and so they would kind of simply be nice to each other and others. Uh, he he talks about race. He says that in the United States, race is mostly not an issue. He said that there's one big exception, which is the black students. He said that he thought that black students didn't really assimilate well with the rest of the student bodies he saw. Um, he gets to this part where he talks about divorce, and he thinks it's really interesting. He does think it's sad. He thinks it's kind of sad that no one in a leadership in a leadership position in our country. I'm American. In our country, has really tried to address divorce the rates went up and the divorce rates went up and they didn't really go down. He says that divorce can be a strong factor in a student's life, something that stops him or her from being able to take the emotional risk involved in taking philosophy seriously. And I remember at the moment when he was discussing the love and eros chapters. He gets to part 2 where he discusses nihilism, American style, and this section is where he describes how nihilism has taken over everywhere in the United States in this American way. And he says that what Americans have done without really realizing it, Americans all over, is that they've started, for one thing, he talks a lot about Nietzsche in this section and onward. He talks about how Nietzsche was the one who claimed that as a result of the Enlightenment, we gradually killed off our ideas about God. And when we lost that, Nietzsche said that what would happen is that the populace would become a value positing people. They would start to make up their own values and trying to embrace them the way they used to embrace God. And if they didn't do this, then they were left with nothing but an abyss where they couldn't really establish morality for themselves. And without that, it was you can't really have good and evil. And without that, it was hard to say whether your neighbor or someone you knew was doing something right or wrong. So from this German school of thought, we got this idea of having values. And most Americans should be able to readily see this. You hear it if you get into discussions about morality while you're out and about in the United States. You'll often hear, well, everyone has their own ethics or everyone has their own values. And this is kind of like how he started the book by saying that Americans think that almost anyone can have their own idea of what's right or wrong. The last chapter in this section is called Our Ignorance. Here he laments that Americans don't really look at history seriously anymore. They don't really see anything in it. And they're poor in their souls because of it. Americans think it's kind of silly, or they don't even bother taking historical Catholicism seriously. They think that there was something silly about people who said that they were Catholic, especially during the age of something like the Crusades, and they think that now all of that's behind us, and so we don't really put our seriousness into our study of ways of thinking about moral life that happened a long time ago. Anything that happened before the 60s, he says, isn't something that's really studied seriously, and that means that Americans today can't really speak intelligently about things that happened in history. And he says that this amounts to ignorance, where we don't really know anything that's happened in the past, and we're kind of left on our own. We have an egalitarian outlook on life, and that's kind of all we have. Part 3 takes a lot. This is a pretty dense book. It's a philosophy book, and it takes a while to get to part 3, but it's a very rewarding part of the book. It's a very exciting part of the book. I don't know how to pronounce this word, Rektorotstred. This chapter is called From Socrates' Apology to Heidegger's Rektorotstred. In this part of the book, he goes back in time and he begins to narrate what has happened historically to people who have tried to have a contemplative, philosophical life. People who have tried to study philosophy, who have wanted to put a lot of the time of their lives into that study, and maybe even try to look at it as a way of life. And all of this is about how things have been in the West. So he starts with the Greeks and goes, and from there he's talking about things that have happened from there through the time of the Roman Empire, through the Dark Ages, through the Renaissance time, and onward. This is really interesting. He says that people like Socrates, Plato, philosophers, or people who live a theoretical life, have had a hard time at all times in history being able to do what they want to do, but also make ends meet. They've always kind of wanted a free lunch, not a free mansion, but a free lunch, so that they can live by themselves and keep on thinking about their abstract topics, things like what is the best way to organize a regime, what is right and wrong given any technological state in a given society. So what these people used to do is they would make friends with what you might call gentlemen. You can think of Leibniz, William Gottfried Leibniz, being friends with the royalty with whom he was friends. I don't remember who they were, but he had these friends in a high position of power, and the philosophers would try to befriend kings or people in positions of power, and that was how they would try to get by in life. And this changed around the time following Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a thinker, he was a philosopher, he was a political writer. And he took this position that the monarchs of the time, the regime leaders, weren't going to come up with a moral way of leading their nations. And so instead, they would become these practical manipulators of everyone's thought, and that was how they would roll. The ends began to justify the means, which was unusual. Before him, philosophers were trying to come up with these ideas of how kings should behave, and they would try to recommend ethical ways of going through life, but Machiavelli stopped doing that, and he said that trying to have virtuous kings was unnecessary. And from that, this is where Bloom says that political thought shifted, and we began to have these ideas about how to organize a regime that were based on compromises that were not really based on this idea that the leaders of the regime would be virtuous at all times, and we would strive toward that. He said that that eventually disappeared. He has a section on Tocqueville. Tocqueville was this French man who went to the United States to study how life was there, and he wrote about it, and he eventually published a book about it. He says that from Tocqueville he learned the importance of the university in a democratic nation such as the United States. And this is where he starts to talk about how universities were supposed to be these strongholds of aristocratic outlook on life. In a democracy, he says, the population is very busy. They're usually working. They don't have the time, the training, or capacity to think about difficult subjects, difficult topics. And so where can the people turn when they want guidance on a difficult subject? He thinks that these philosophers are the people that the population at large can trust and to whom they can turn in times of philosophic or political crisis. And he says that the universities in the United States should be places where that happens. Tocqueville was the man who introduced this idea to Bloom. There's an underlying assumption here that in order to have a moral life, to have good principles, you have to have a significant amount of time in your life where you're not simply worried about working. And for Americans, even successful Americans, we don't seem to think about this. But how can Americans really have time to think about difficult things if all they're doing is cranking out productivity 5 days a week, and then on the weekends trying to do something fun, regardless of how wealthy they are? At some point, either in this part 2 or part 3, he talks about how the middle, in the United States, we have something that we describe as the middle class, but in Europe and at other times in history, they've described it as the bourgeoisie. And a lot of serious thinkers, a lot of philosophical thinkers have had a fear, a trepidation, a concern about the bourgeoisie, because all they really seem to do is work. They hurry around in life in frenzied work and frenzied play, and they don't have any time to think about profound topics such as morality in their lives. They don't really make time to do it. And then you get these people who are you get this way of life that can be sickening. Certainly, at least to a philosopher. And he says that this is the vulnerability of a nation, a democratic nation like the United States. He talks about the Enlightenment transformation and Swift's doubts. These are two chapter names. So with the Enlightenment, we have this set of thinkers: Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke. They started putting together this mental experiment with which to organize regimes. Um, Hobbes postulated that humans live a really brutish life, and to get around this, they come up with a regime to help put some order into their lives. And Locke kind of continued this idea, and we, from them and from the founding fathers of the United States, we came up with this idea that a government of a country is established by the consent of the governed. In this country, Bloom says we had a very strong idea of these things called self-evident natural rights. We don't really talk about this that much in this country anymore, but there was a time when um, they were a very big part of what was right and wrong in this country. Um, which I think is true. I remember reading this novel, The Killer Angels, and there was this characterization of people in the South talking about my rats, and I thought, what was it? What RATS? And they were saying my rights, and the people in the South were trying to use this terminology, this language to describe their way of life and describe it as if it was something that was okay. So this language used to be in the United States, and it kind of disappeared over time, replaced by the openness we have now. Um, but this seizing of control from the monarchs by these philosophers was a big deal. They weren't going to um, be friends with gentlemen anymore and try to secure their meals and shelter in that way anymore. Instead, they were going to play a leadership role in how regimes were going to be organized going forward. When he talks about Swift doubts, he talks about Jonathan Swift's description of Laputa in his writing. Laputa was this place where he says it's obviously modeled after the Royal Society in England. He says there are these natural philosophers who act like they don't care about politics or political science, and they go and hide in the clouds, and all they supposedly are doing is thinking about science and doing all this scientific research. But from time to time, they dart out to make assertions about political science or about current events or about politics, and then they retreat back into their um, places of research to go back to their scientific research. And Swift thinks this is strange. He thinks that there's an element of hypocrisy in the Royal Society. He doesn't think that all they're doing is scientific research. He thinks that they have all these ideas about politics, and they leak these ideas from time to time. And he thinks it's a very half-committed way of life for the philosophers who have joined the Royal Society. Um, so he doesn't think that it's a sincere way of organizing the regime by the philosophers, by Hobbes, by Rousseau, by Locke. He doesn't think it's. He thinks he's skeptical about it. That's why he calls this chapter Swift's doubts. Rousseau's radicalization. This might be the part where he talks about Rousseau. So Rousseau, uh, he didn't like what Locke had written. He thought that some kind of culture was very necessary um, for a government in order to have a peaceful, prosperous society. And he thought that Locke's idea of a democracy being held by a population that was theoretically simply chasing happiness and chasing its self-interest was an enormous miscalculation. Rousseau thought this enormous moral element of life was missing from that way of organizing a nation. He does at different parts of part three talk about what life was like in German universities, especially at the time that Heidegger gave his uh, Rextrad Street speech. Heidegger, there eventually became a philosophical problem for everyone in the West at the university level, where they couldn't um, they couldn't complete the answer to Nietzsche's problem that I already talked about. They couldn't come up with values for their societies, and they weren't really able to give the universities weren't really able to give anyone a solution to that problem. Heidegger had this speech where he says that the students of Germany have willed a certain way of life, so let's give it to them. And he kind of offloaded all this philosophical responsibility that the German universities could have had off of his shoulders and say, hey, if the students are in favor of this, let's go ahead and embrace it. And I think this was a way for the University of Germany at the time to yield to what Hitler and his administration was trying to do in Germany. And obviously World War II came out of that. He eventually gets to this chapter called the 60s. And he describes what happened here in the United States. He talks about his life at Cornell and how eventually the students, he talks about how educational life was in a precarious position at that time. There was this civil rights movement at the time. There was a lot of pressure to bring in students who didn't necessarily have good grades, but they were somehow ethnically different. This chapter comes to a head when he talks about how these militant black students took control of a library at Cornell, and they were holding some people hostage, and they wanted some change. I don't know what the change was. I think they might have wanted certain access to classes to which they didn't have access, or something like that. And the university president capitulated to their requests. And Bloom was not in favor of this. He tried to complain about it to the professor or to the president, but the president didn't yield his position. And Bloom says that this had a bad effect on the universities. What ended up happening was that the curriculum was severely compromised. The standard of grading was compromised. And he says that all of the humanities professors in the United States at the time began to lose any prestige that they once had. Either in this section or a different section of the book, he talks about how students these days, when they go to take humanities courses, he says they're like tourists. They walk into the classroom and they read some of the material, and they are tourists in that they are leaving. They're not going to take any of it seriously. It's something that it's like they're smelling roses, but looking at something that has nothing to do with their lives. And he says it's sad because the humanities professors are teaching things in this lukewarm way, where they are no longer imparting to students knowledge that can be used by the students to help them think systematically about profound issues or moral issues. That's not what's happening anymore. He says that the curriculum by the university administrations has been gutted. They don't really have a systematic curriculum anymore. They don't really teach students. They don't teach them what you might call a narrative that brings in a bunch of elements from historical thought. And I can say from personal experience and from what I've read in Bloom that there's this systematic assault, even by the professors who are in the humanities department. Some of them, there's a systematic assault on everything that happened before the 60s. All the writing, all the thought, all the effort that went into describing a virtuous life prior to the 60s has been, at least with respect to its profoundness, discarded. It's been discredited. We describe philosophers of old as these selfish people who were repetitively trying to manipulate either the large population surrounding them or the leaders beside them into giving them nice things for free without having any integrity. And so now the people working in the humanities departments in the United States, in a sense, don't have anything meaningful to do. They don't really have the positions of prestige that Tocqueville thought they should have anymore. It's not really clear what their purpose is. There's actually a point in this book where Bloom says, why have universities? What do we need them for? Why don't we simply provide technical training to people so that they can go get jobs? Why do we go through this hassle of having a humanities department if we can't come up with a curriculum to give to students? And I think he talks about this in the last chapters of this book. The decomposition of the university is a description of how the different departments in the university reacted to the problem in the 60s, to all the student protests and revolution. So the engineering school went one way. I think he says the engineering school boarded up the windows and didn't do anything, speaking figuratively. He says the sociology department for a little while tried to stand by the university's professors, but then stopped. He talks about the psychology department. He talks about all the different departments in the universities reacted to the problem in the 60s, how things fell apart. The disciplines, it's been a while, but I think that's how now all the disciplines in the university are really fractured. We don't really have a way of reconciling what's taught in one department with what's taught in another. We don't really deliver a body of truth encompassing all the departments at a given time to the student. We don't give them a curriculum that accounts for everything that's being taught in the different departments to the students these days. And in the conclusion, he says that we have an interesting problem on our hands. He says that unlike the regimes that fell in the past, the United States is a regime that's founded on philosophical principle. And if we can't come up with if the philosophers of today, he says, can't come up with a solution to the value positing problem, then they're not going to regain their prestige. And if they don't, then the universities aren't going to have a solid purpose going forward. And if that's the case, then he doesn't know how we can stop this decline in the West. Certainly, at least with respect to our prestige. And it's a very nice chapter where he says a lot of nice things, a lot of really eloquent things about this problem. So it's weird to me to say that this book is simply doing a bunch of name dropping for no reason. It's weird to me to say that this book is somehow a thing that can be used as a defense of the right. I don't think this book is a book about truth. It's a book about a crisis in higher education in the United States. Certainly at the beginning of the book, it talks about a lot of things that are kind of sad in the United States. We don't really have culture here. I, to myself, am left a little bit to wonder what that might be like. So I think what this book for me did was it explained to me how it's not really that strange that I do care about philosophy, that I do want to have a portion of my life that isn't spent working all the time, 40 hours a week, but is spent simply thinking about philosophy and maybe not even having to work that hard, especially if I don't care about having expensive vacations or things like that. It explains to me how I do long for something resembling tradition, or at least the sacred. It explains to me that I'm not alone in thinking that a lot of the American talk about values is broken, is not actually a way of looking at life with integrity. So if you get the chance to go through this book, I read pretty slowly. It took me a very long time to read this book, but if you care about philosophy, then this is a really nice book to go through. Thank you.